So my name is Susana Alves. I come from the northeast of Brazil, from a city called João Pessoa in Paraíba. I was educated in psychology, so this is my first degree. I have a master's in environmental psychology from the University of Brasilia. And then I went to the US for my PhD, which I did in architecture. So I'm not really an architect. I always wanted to be a psychologist, but I tried to apply knowledge from psychology to design. So now I am teaching in Istanbul in the Department of Architecture. And before that, I was in the UK, in Edinburgh, at the Edinburgh College of Art, and I did work on street environments at that time. I stayed there for 5 years. So I'm going to talk a bit about this work and mixing up what I did in Edinburgh with what I did in my master's and what I'm doing now in Istanbul. Okay, shall I start? How should I stand? Maybe like this. Okay. So today I wanted to propose an affordance analysis to analyze street settings and to show how this kind of analysis can be very important to design supportive environments, especially for pedestrian use. I think such an analysis is important because it can serve as a useful tool for design to review those aspects of street settings which affect psychological well-being, health, and quality of life. All these components that are very much in debate today. Oh. So I'm going to structure my presentation in 3 points. First of all, I'm going to explain to you this concept of affordances, which I have been using in my work since my master's. It comes from a theory in perception in psychology. Then I'm going to show you some results that we got from studying street environments in the UK. And then I'm going to talk a bit about my work now in Mediterranean and North African streets in terms of this other concept of ambience. So what are affordances? Affordances is a concept in psychology proposed by James Gibson. He's an environmental psychologist from the US. This is a very kind of revolutionary concept because it's the first time that we see a theory in psychology which tries to balance two sides, environment and people. It tries to bring these two things together. So it frees us from a dualistic view of human behavior. So in fact, when we look at something, what we perceive are the affordances that these things bring to us. To say that is to say that we look at something and this sensing and this perception is not disconnected from our evaluation and from what we feel in relation to these things. So when we see a table, for example, we see that we could put some glasses in it. So this surface allows us to do some kind of action. So affordances is a concept that gives lots of power to the person. It emphasizes action. So Gibson says that we perceive with the eyes in the head on the body resting on the ground. This is really to illustrate that it's not just a visual mechanism and that these things are not separated. So it's very much a systemic view of perception. Affordances are, in a short way, the possibilities of action that we can have from artifacts, from objects, from other people, and from the social situations that we create in relation to them. It's not just an individual process, but it is a social process as well. So affordances are not in the environment. They are as well not in the head. It's not a subjective process, but in fact it is this mixture of the two. So this is an important point, and this is an important worldview because it shapes everything in terms of design, how you understand design and how you propose to work with design. How can we use this concept to study street environments? I propose here to look at 3 characteristics, fixed, non-fixed, and semi-fixed features. Fixed are like paths or buildings, the architecture of the street. Non-fixed are the things that can be moved, like mobile, the mobilia or the furniture. And semi-fixed are people and their activities. I think it is the interplay or the connection between these 3 components that really give us the quality of that environment, of the ambience, or I could even say the personality of the place. It's by looking at these components. So maybe this is more clear for you who like to look at diagrams. So this is what I mean. This is a relational kind of approach. We have the people, we have the environment. If you want to understand people in terms of design, you have to consider their different characteristics, that they have different ages, different socio-cultural characteristics. The environment is pretty much everything that surrounds us. So again, let's think of a systemic approach. And how do we actualize our activities, the things that we do on a daily basis? Everything we do, we are relating to an environment. My proposal here is to operationalize this in terms of affordances, looking at these 3 characteristics that I have mentioned. And the final objective is to study this in relation to quality of life. Can we promote quality of life, health, and psychological well-being by doing such an analysis? Can street environments be used really to promote quality of life for people in different urban places? I think it can. So I'm going now to explain a bit about this project. It was a very long one. It is called IGO, Inclusive Design for Getting Outdoors. It was funded in the UK, and I worked there as a postdoc researcher. So the main purpose was to know what are the environment attributes that support pedestrian behavior, especially for older people. It was funded to be conducted with people who are 65 and older. They have this concern everywhere, but in the UK as well, that people are getting older, they are getting more unhealthy. They don't leave the house, they are kind of prisoners of their own home. And they want to promote aging in place. They want people to stay in their houses for as long as possible and to age in connection with their own neighborhood. So that was the rationale for the project. In the second phase of this project, we looked at several streets. They had this program to promote or to renovate streets in deprived areas in the UK. It was part of the Sustrans do-it-yourself streets. So it was really a great opportunity for us to look at streets before and after they did these interventions. They wanted to promote quality of life for everyone, but in our project, we look mainly at older people. So we did research in all these places in the UK. I was based in Edinburgh at the time. So it was a longitudinal study comparing before and after streets in terms of the interventions they were doing. And most of them were in deprived areas. So we had, in fact, 9 sites, 8 sites in England and Wales, and 1 site in Edinburgh. The streets were like this. What we did for our study, every experimental street, we had a control street. So these streets, these photographs are before the interventions. So they had specific places in the streets that they wanted to change. For example, such as this intersection in London. This is a street that wouldn't be changed, the one in the lower part. This other one is another example in Port Talbot, and this is the control street. For each experimental street, we had a control street. So just for you to have an idea of the streets. So we applied lots of instruments. I worked very hard during this time. We did interviews, we applied questionnaires, we gave people accelerometers to measure their levels of activity, etc. So this is not so important, but this is just for you to understand that all these instruments were applied at the baseline phase and then after the intervention, so post-intervention. So we compared this kind of data. So basically, if I can summarize the main objectives to you, is to understand the influence of the environment on outdoor activity, well-being and quality of life, and as well to look at the levels of physical activity. And for that, we use accelerometers. We ask people to keep an accelerometer for the period of 1 week. And at the same time, we ask them to keep an activity diary. So we wanted to combine, let's say, more qualitative with more quantitative measures in this project. I tried to summarize as best, the results for you. So one of the questions was, do changes to the local street environment affect behavior and quality of life? These results that we got, and this has been published now, the environmental changes had an impact on perceptions of street walkability and safety at night, but not really on the activity levels. By that I mean people didn't walk more after the interventions. The interventions were not effective in that regard. It was very important to park one's car outside the house, this especially for old people. They feel they are very independent when they can use their cars. But the levels of activities didn't change much. In fact, in the UK, they say that you should walk at least 30 minutes every day. This is the overall recommendation. And our participants didn't even reach that, meaning that the activity levels were quite low. So the changes that they provided in the streets were not enough to really encourage people to walk more, unfortunately. Another dimension of the project was in terms of what we call personal projects analysis. This is a kind of method in psychology. I'm not going to explain the details of this, but basically everything you do is a personal project if it's goal-oriented. So today I had the objective of giving this lecture to you. This is a personal project. In 2 years, maybe I want to go back to Brazil. This is another personal project. So these things are the things we do on a daily basis. So we ask people to list their personal projects and how easy or difficult the environment made it for them to achieve these things. This is very important because older people are really limited to their immediate neighborhood. So we want to know what things in the neighborhood were supportive of their activities. So we calculated a score for this supportiveness of the environment. And we found out that as they evaluated the environment as being more supportive, they evaluated as well that they could do more things, or the things that were important to them as personal projects. So a supportive environment, to confirm previous research, is very important. What do I mean by a supportive environment? This means having paths that are walkable, that are of good quality, have trees or an environment which is attractive, having no nuisance in the streets, nothing that is considered as dangerous, etc. So we had different items to measure this, and I can, of course, provide all this information if you are interested. This is just to show to you that we have been combining different ways of looking at the environment. The last part of this study, we did lots of observations in streets. In fact, we looked at or observed almost like 4,000 pedestrians, involving everyone and how they use the streets. Basically, we wanted to evaluate the environmental attributes in the streets and observe how they were used by participants. Maybe this is a better way of explaining to you. So we had different things. The list was longer than this. These were the ones that were found most important at the end of the study. all these attributes. So we had what we call an environmental audit. We would go in pairs up and down the street and evaluate everything. The sidewalk, can 2 people, 3 people walk in this, the quality of the path, how many trees, the housing, what type, all the details that we could get. I'm going to mention or explain to you just the first ones in terms of open space, trees, and green spaces. Perhaps I should explain as well that when we're looking at these attributes, we ask, what do they afford? Coming back to the concept of affordances. What do they provide to people in terms of daily use? What kind of activities do they provide? So it's a different way of looking at these things. We classified streets in 3 categories, like low, medium, and high amounts of open and green spaces. And we found out that the ones with the highest amount of open and green spaces were as well the ones in which we observed the highest frequency of social interaction. This has been confirmed by previous research, which poses that vegetation and good aesthetics are good elements to encourage social interaction. So these are typical streets that we observe, like this in Turkey, and this one had lots of vegetation. All these sites were considered to be in deprivation areas, so they were not the most vegetation, how do you say, lots of vegetation in the UK, yes. Yeah. So this is, if we come back to kind of summarize this before I get to the other part, what are the implications of all of this in terms of how can we apply this kind of research to design? And what are the implications in terms of health and psychological well-being? I think an affordance analysis, because it asks, what does this thing or this environmental attribute provide to people? It allows us to see the positive and the negative qualities and contextualize this, because we are dealing here with concrete environments, concrete situations, and activities as well. We are dealing with everyday life, what people do in a daily basis. So I think as well this analysis is important because it brings people to the agenda, so to speak. It is a participatory approach to design, planning and management of urban landscapes, because you cannot do otherwise. You really have to take into account daily activities and the surrounding environment. I think maybe this is not new, but it can be better practiced. The second part of the work that I'm trying to do now, since I'm based in Istanbul, is to look at Mediterranean streets. I have been to a conference kind of 2 weeks ago in Tunis, where we tried to examine the affordances of Mediterranean streets. What do they provide? What is characteristic of these streets, and how they can be improved? Because there are so many changes happening in Tunis or happening in Istanbul and all these places. So what are some of the traditional elements of these streets? What kind of situations and ambiances do they provide? Ambiances is another good concept, I think, to relate to street environments. And I think it's makes a very good pair with affordances, because ambiances refers to the feeling that you have for a specific place. It's almost that places have personalities as people. You know, you can go to a place and see, oh, this is a welcoming, this is a warm place, or this is a boring place. So, of course, we have feelings in relation to different places. I wanted to mention just the 2 points, and perhaps the other points we can look at during the workshop. Otherwise, it becomes too much. And perhaps these are the most interesting ones. So let's look at some spatial forms and what they afford. I have been interested in this concept of in-between spaces. I don't know if you are familiar with Ian Gale. He has this book, Life Between Buildings. So it's the same kind of rationale. these spaces that are kind of under pressure, in between, what can we do with them? What are the advantages of them in very dense urban spaces, such as São Paulo, Istanbul, Mexico City, etc. If you look at the traditional streets in Mediterranean countries, you see that they have these kinds of spaces. I have learned since I went to Istanbul that they are called alfina. This is an Arabic word to express these in-between spaces. For example, in a residential street, the space close to the facade of the building, about 1 meter, is used differently. It has different purposes. One of the purposes, as you can see here, is privacy. It provides, especially women, to look at the street, to see what's going on without being seen. So this was very important in vernacular architecture. And my question is how this is used these days and how this element can be mimicked in a way to serve contemporary uses. So the off-inner space is similar to the affordances concept. It is really in between. It doesn't belong just to the environment. It doesn't belong just to people. It's this connection, as you can see in this diagram here. It is an in-between kind of feature. So in the commercial streets, it was very important. It provided different ambiances as people exposed their goods. For example, in a bazaar, if you go to the Grand Bazaar, or if you go to a Minonu in Istanbul, you're going to see these spaces, a lot of them, and how people use them very creatively, in a creative way, I mean. In residential streets, again, one of the features was to provide privacy, but as well to serve as a mediation between the public, sacred life space, as they posed it, and the public space of the street. This is an old photograph that I took from a book, but you can see that people could even socialize when they're cleaning. And in fact, these spaces are very similar to the spaces I'm familiar with in the northeast of Brazil. These days even, people go every morning and clean the sidewalks. So it is a way to say, bom dia, good morning, and to have a chat with the neighbor. So it's very important for socialization in my country. At night, people put the chairs in the sidewalk, and it's kind of another moment to socialize. I want to bring to your attention that these features, they have tangible, let's say physical elements, but they have non-tangible elements as well. This is very important, especially for this UNESCO heritage program, which tries to integrate tangible and non-tangible aspects of the environment. For example, if you want to preserve streets, or if you want to preserve some neighborhoods in Mediterranean cities, how do you go about doing this? I think still today, some of these things are very disconnected. It's almost like you have tangible elements and you have non-tangible, as if they were disconnected. How can you have a feeling or an appreciation for a place without considering the physical elements? So I think, in fact, that the UNESCO program and some of these international programs would benefit from a more ecological approach to perception and management of urban spaces. So this I have explained to you. Those are the things that were mentioned before. But as well, in between spaces, they have this kind of archetype of a third position. And I think this is full of meaning, in fact. What can you do when you are in kind of a threshold region? What kind of affordances does it provide? I think it does have a great effect in life, because in terms of psychological well-being, because this not being exactly in one place allows you to do different things. Let me try to explain it better. This is in Istanbul. I just took these photographs last year. It's trivial photographs, but you can see that people use the spaces in the streets a lot. The streets are very lively in Istanbul, as I considered as well in Brazil. So they drink tea everywhere. They put their small stands and they expose their goods everywhere as well. This is in Kadikoi in the Asian side, but you can see this as well in the European side. So my question to you is, what are the supportive elements of these in-between spaces? In my opinion, one striking feature is that they provide playful behavior. This is another example in the street, and I call these positive distractions. This comes from a theory in psychology again, meaning that it engages people in a different way. It's a non-utilitarian kind of activity. And I think it's kind of a breathing space. It allows people to breathe a bit because they are so stressed. We have to do so many things. We have to go about so many activities. So when we have this kind of intermediary space in our lives, it can be very positive. This is a recent one from Rome. All of them are in relation to street performers, but this could be amplified. This is just a simple example to bring your attention to the playful character of streets. And this playful element, I think it can be worked out in between spaces. In fact, we can create different ambiances and provide different affordances in these spaces. This, I think I explained too, it's really this characteristic of being in the middle that provides this. It allows change and choice to be exercised. I think a great point these days is to provide environments which are flexible, which allows people to behave in different ways. So this is one point in relation to urban design. Perhaps we can explore this question later on in the workshop, but how can environmental design be used to change the ambience of a street in order to improve quality of life? This is a question that I'm pursuing in my studies now. I think the affordances analysis provided here, or what I try to illustrate to you, shows the need to consider this interplay of features, both fixed and non-fixed, tangible and non-tangible elements. It is, I think, just by looking at the interplay that we can successfully design urban spaces. And I think these traditional elements in Mediterranean streets can be used as precedent for design. They can serve as good examples, and they can be applied to contemporary design as well. I have several references, lots of things that I find interesting that I'm able to share with you. And for now, thank you very much.